300,000 years ago, 9 different species of humans walked this planet. Every one of them had a brain. Every one of them controlled fire. Every one of them had tools, social bonds, and the ability to survive conditions that would have wiped out almost any other animal. 8 of the 9 vanished. 1 survived. That one species is you. The real question isn't who those other 8 were. The real question is why you made it through and they didn't. Now let's be precise about what we actually mean by 9 species of humans. This isn't about 9 races or 9 cultures. We're talking about 9 genuinely separate biological species. In some cases, the differences between them were roughly like the difference between a wolf and a coyote, or a lion and a leopard. Certain pairings among these beings could interbreed, and sometimes did. But geography, climate, and millions of years of separate evolution had pushed them apart, shaping distinct skull structures, body proportions, brain sizes, and behaviors. 9 different versions of what it meant to be human existed on the same planet at the same time, competing for the same resources, hunting the same prey, and sheltering in the same caves. For the last 40,000 years, we've been alone. One species, one planet. A monopoly so total that we forgot it was ever any other way. But go back a little further, and the picture changes completely. 300,000 years is nothing on a geological scale, just a blink. And yet in that blink, the world looked unrecognizable. It was full of us, full of different versions of humanity competing with one another. And the outcome that produced the world you live in today wasn't guaranteed. Things could easily have gone another way. Our victory was never a sure thing. To understand just how close that outcome really was, we need to start with the ones who lost. And we'll begin at the beginning, not with Homo sapiens. We'll come back to ourselves last, because our story is the ending here, not the opening. Let's go back 2.5 million years to East Africa, to the creature that first earned the name Homo. Homo habilis, handyman as the name translates. It wasn't given for how it looked, but for what it seemed to have been doing, or more precisely, for what was found lying next to its remains. In 1960, a team led by Louis and Mary Leakey uncovered fossilized remains in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, surrounded by thousands of stone tools. The tools were crude, pieces of rock struck against each other to leave a sharp edge, a cutting surface, or a scraper. But they were tools all the same, deliberately made, deliberately used, and found again and again beside remains of the same kind. The researchers called this species habilis, meaning skilled or capable, because the conclusion seemed obvious. Here was the one who made them. By modern standards, Homo habilis wouldn't have impressed anyone, but its brain is worth pausing on. It was larger than that of the Australopithecines before it, the pre-human hominids that came before the genus Homo. Still, compared to every human that came later, it remained small, somewhere between 500 and 800 cubic centimeters, against roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters in modern humans. Cubic centimeters. In many ways, its face still looked ape-like, a jutting jaw, a low forehead, heavy brow ridges. Its arms were long relative to its body, still a sign of a life spent partly among the trees. He was small, standing maybe 1 to 1.5 meters tall, and weighing somewhere between 30 and 37 kilograms.
Nothing about him suggested a top predator. Nothing hinted that his lineage would one day give rise to a creature capable of reaching the moon. And yet tools specifically, changed everything. Because a stone tool isn't just a rock, it's an idea given physical form. Making one requires a mental leap, an understanding that one object can be used to change another, that nature holds materials that can be shaped toward a specific purpose, that effort invested now creates new possibilities later. Every stone tool is a tiny embodiment of abstract thought, and Homo habilis was making them 2.5 million years ago in a world where predators were bigger, faster, and stronger than anything he could handle with his bare hands. But in the early Pleistocene, Homo habilis wasn't alone. Alongside him lived another species, one that stayed in the shadows for a long time and looked so similar that researchers argued for decades over whether this was one animal or actually two distinct ones. Homo rudolfensis was named after the lake known today as Turkana in Kenya, where its skull was first discovered. Its brain was larger than habilis's, possibly somewhere between 700 and 800 cubic centimeters, and its face was flatter and wider.
Still, it remains unclear whether rudolfensis was truly a separate species or just a variant of habilis. That debate continues in the scientific literature to this day. One thing is certain, though. The landscapes of early Pleistocene East Africa were home to at least two distinct populations of upright, tool-making hominins competing for space and resources. And both of them, in the end, vanished without leaving direct descendants in the modern human line. This was the first act, experiments that showed what the genus Homo could become, and proved that simply belonging to Homo was no guarantee of survival. The species that completely changed the rules appeared roughly 2 million years ago, and it did so not because it was smarter, not because it had a more advanced culture or a more complex social structure, but because it started spreading out. Homo erectus, upright man. The name is a bit misleading. Habilis walked upright too, as did rudolfensis, but the name reflects the historical moment of its discovery. When 19th century researchers first laid eyes on the fossil remains of this creature and realized, with a certain shock, that they were looking at something unmistakably human in posture and way of moving, Homo erectus stood fully upright. It walked with a gait mechanically similar to ours. Its legs were long, longer relative to its arms than in any hominin before it, and with that, the anatomical gap between tree-climbing apes and ground-dwelling humans narrowed noticeably. And its brain was significantly bigger than any of its predecessors, ranging from about 750 cubic centimeters in the earliest specimens to more than 1,100 in the later ones. The brain kept growing over nearly 2 million years of continuous evolution. 2 million years. Let's pause on that number. Homo erectus existed as a recognizable species for about 2 million years. Roughly from 2 million years ago, and in some populations until about 100,000 years ago, with certain populations on Java possibly surviving even to 40,000 years ago. For comparison, Homo sapiens has existed for about 300,000 years. We've been modern humans for less than 1/6 of the time that Homo erectus walked the earth. If Homo erectus could speak about our species today, it would have every right to point out that we're the newcomers here, an experiment that's still running its course. A species that hasn't yet proven it can last as long as it did. Homo erectus was the first hominid to ever leave Africa. The oldest remains of this species found outside the continent turned up in Dmanisi in Georgia. That's the ancient Georgia in the Caucasus, not the American state. Those fossils are roughly 1,800,000 years old. In other words, within just 200,000 years of emerging in Africa, Homo erectus had already walked all the way to the edge of Europe. A few 100,000 years after that, it reached what is now China, and a few 100,000 years beyond that, it crossed a narrow stretch of sea and ended up on the island of Java in Indonesia. Doing that meant either deliberately crossing on some kind of floating craft or using a land bridge that opened up when sea levels dropped during an ice age. The fossil record of Homo erectus stretches across a vast area and 2 million years, and it doesn't show us one uniform creature. What we see instead is an extremely flexible and adaptable species, one that managed to survive in the tropical savanna of Africa, the temperate forests of Europe, the dry steppes of Central Asia, the subtropical forests of China, and the tropical jungles of Indonesia, all at once. Different populations of Homo erectus ended up with different body proportions, different skull shapes, and their own distinct ways of making tools. Some of them used fire. In Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, there's evidence of controlled fire use by Homo erectus dating back about 1 million years. Later traces of fire use have also been found in China and in Europe. Certain populations seem to have hunted large animals together as a group. There are also signs that they cared for the injured and the elderly. A skull of Homo erectus found at Dmanisi belonged to an individual who had lost every tooth long before dying, yet lived on for many more years afterward. In a world of raw meat and tough plant food, surviving without teeth for that long would have required either help from other members of the group or an extraordinarily developed skill at preparing food with tools. And then Homo erectus vanished. Not all at once. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a slow fading away, population by population, as other members of the genus Homo spread out and the climate kept changing. The very combination of traits that had let erectus thrive in so many different environments eventually wasn't enough to withstand new competition. The last populations on Java may have survived until as recently as 40,000 years ago, which means Homo erectus and Homo sapiens almost certainly shared the planet at the same time for a long stretch. What happened when they crossed paths, we don't know. The fossil record gives no clear answer to that, but there's no doubt about how it all ended. Now we come to a species that stands like a ghost right at the center of human history. Under a different turn of events, this one could easily have been us, Homo heidelbergensis. The name comes from a German city near which the first remains were discovered back in 1907, a single lower jawbone from a sand quarry near Mauer. Homo heidelbergensis lived roughly from 700,000 to 200,000 years ago. By pretty much any measure, this was an advanced being. Its brain was large, falling within the range of modern humans, with many specimens measuring between 1,100 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. It made wooden spears. The Schöningen spears, discovered in Germany, are about 300,000 years old. They were carefully crafted from spruce wood and balanced for flight. Modern tests have confirmed that these were effective throwing weapons. They were made by a human being. This species most likely had some form of language, not necessarily as complex as ours, but the anatomical structures connected with speech were already there. Homo heidelbergensis was either the ancestor, or at least the closest relative, of both the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Around 400,000 years ago, one African population of Homo heidelbergensis began branching off onto a path that eventually led to our own species. Around the same time, or maybe a little earlier, a population in Europe and Western Asia started branching off onto a line that would later lead to the Neanderthals. The two lines split apart. The African branch gradually grew more slender in build and more flexible in thinking, laying down the anatomical and neural groundwork for modern human intelligence. The European branch turned into the Neanderthals, stocky, built for cold, incredibly strong, with brains at least as large as ours, and sometimes even bigger. The Neanderthals deserve a detailed conversation of their own. They're the most thoroughly studied of our extinct relatives, and their story is the one most closely woven together with ours. Homo neanderthalensis, named after the Neander Valley in Germany, where the first remains recognized by science were found back in 1856, lived roughly from 400,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. They were nothing like the hunched, dim-witted cave dwellers of popular imagination. That image, which came out of 19th century reconstructions and has stuck around in pop culture with surprising staying power despite being thoroughly disproven by science, was based on a single skeleton found at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. That skeleton belonged to an older man suffering from severe arthritis, and his stoop was a result of illness, not a typical trait. A real Neanderthal stood fully upright, had a build similar to a strong modern human, and had a brain that was on average slightly bigger than ours, around 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. Exactly what Neanderthals did with a brain like that has kept paleoanthropologists busy for decades, and the answers keep shifting. We know they made stone tools. The Mousterian toolkit, linked to Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, involved sophisticated technology. A stone core would be carefully shaped in advance, and then a flake would be struck off it. This method, known as the Levallois technique, required planning, spatial reasoning, and real manual skill. We know they controlled fire. Neanderthal hearths turn up across Eurasia, and with every new site that gets studied, the evidence grows stronger that they deliberately produced fire rather than simply taking advantage of wildfires. We know they buried their dead. At a number of sites, including Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Ferracie in France, Neanderthals were placed in clearly deliberate positions inside grave-like hollows, sometimes along with objects that may have been offerings. We know they took care of the injured and the sick. Shanidar 1, an adult male found in Iraq back in the 1950s, shows signs of many serious injuries suffered over the course of his life. A withered right arm, likely amputated or paralyzed from the shoulder down, a damaged eye socket suggesting lost vision, a healed skull fracture, and severe arthritis throughout his skeleton. This man lived for years with injuries like these, and in the world Neanderthals lived in, that was only possible with help from others. Someone fed him when he couldn't hunt for himself. Someone gave him shelter when he couldn't build it on his own. That is not how a primitive animal behaves. This is how a social species behaves, one capable of empathy, one that understands the group benefits from supporting its members even when they can't directly contribute to survival. And there's another discovery, maybe the most radical one, that changed everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals. They interbred with Homo sapiens. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, first carried out by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, work that earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, showed that between 1% and 4% of the genome of every living person outside Africa traces back to Neanderthals. Every person of European, Asian, or Native American descent
carries Neanderthal DNA. Among the genes we inherited from them are variants tied to immunity, ones that helped modern humans fight off pathogens in new environments after leaving Africa, along with variants related to skin and hair suited to higher latitudes with less sunlight. Neanderthals didn't simply vanish. Part of them was absorbed into us, but only part. As a distinct species, they stopped existing, and the question remains why? Why didn't a species with a brain the size of ours, with fire, tools, language, complex social life, and 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the European environment, survive the arrival of Homo sapiens on their land? It's one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology, and the competing theories don't rule each other out. The climate was already shifting. Between 50 and 40,000 years ago, Europe's climate swung sharply, and the Neanderthal population was under pressure, likely already weakened and fragmented. Competition with Homo sapiens over food resources, especially large game that both species relied on, only added to that pressure. Direct violence between the two species can't be ruled out either, and it may well have played a real part. And the math of population growth is unforgiving.
If Homo sapiens had even a slight edge in reproduction or survival over Neanderthals, if just a few more sapiens children lived long enough to have children of their own, if their groups could sustain a slightly larger population on the same land, then over thousands of generations, the arithmetic of population dynamics leads inevitably to one outcome. Neanderthals didn't need to be wiped out. It was enough for the other species to hold a small but steady advantage in something decisive over a long stretch of time. What that advantage actually was is still not known for certain. Some researchers point to symbolic thought, the ability to create abstract symbols and communicate through them, which may have let Homo sapiens' social networks grow larger, more flexible, and better at passing useful information across distance and time. Others point to projectile weapons, spears thrown with the help of a spear thrower, and later the bow, which let sapiens hunters kill from a distance, cutting the physical risk of hunting large, dangerous animals and making us more effective predators. Still others focus on the size of social networks. It seems Homo sapiens kept up trade and exchange links across much larger territories than Neanderthals did. Materials, genes, and ideas moved across hundreds of kilometers, and any local group could tap into resources from distant regions. Whatever that edge was, it was enough. 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals still lived across all of Europe and Western Asia. 30,000 years ago, they were gone. Now let's turn to a group that until fairly recently was the least known branch of the human family. It wasn't discovered through a fossil skeleton at all, but purely through genetics. When this group first came to light, there was no face, no skeleton, no known archaeology tied to it. There was only a fragment of genetic sequence pulled from a tiny piece of finger bone. The Denisovans. In 2008, archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia found a small fragment of a finger bone, the tip bone from a young woman who lived around 40,000 years ago. The fragment was so small that in almost any other circumstance it would have gone unnoticed. But the team working in Svante Pääbo's lab managed to extract ancient DNA from it. What they found was startling. The DNA clearly belonged to a human, a member of the genus Homo. But it wasn't Homo sapiens, and it wasn't a Neanderthal either. It was a third group, one science had never encountered before, related to both Neanderthals and modern humans, yet genetically distinct from both. That is how the Denisovans came to be known, The DNA was human, but it belonged to no group anyone had identified. Years of research that followed revealed that this group, which at first seemed small and confined to one place, was actually vast, spread across huge distances and ecologically varied, having lived across much of East and Southeast Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. We know how wide their range was, not from fossils, since almost none exist, but from DNA. The genomes of present-day populations across Asia, Australia, and the Pacific carry Denisovan DNA in varying amounts. Among Papuans and Aboriginal Australians, Denisovan DNA makes up roughly 3 to 5% of their genetic makeup, one of the highest shares found in any living human population. Among the Philippine Negrito peoples, the figure is even higher, around 5%, the highest recorded in any single population. Among Han Chinese and other East Asian populations, it's only about 0.2%. Indigenous peoples of the Americas also carry Denisovan ancestry, but it's a different strand from the one found in Oceania, which points to a separate mixing event with another Denisovan population that took place during the migration across Beringia. The way Denisovan DNA is spread among people today shows that the Denisovans weren't one single uniform population, but rather a collection of separate regional groups. Each group adapted to its own environment, and each interbred with Homo sapiens at different times and in different places as our ancestors moved across Asia. There were at least 2 such separate interbreeding events, possibly 3. The traces of these encounters are written into the DNA of people alive today, and the Denisovan DNA that survives in modern populations turns out to be far from random. Natural selection actively favored it. The best documented case is the EPAS1 gene. It's tied to regulating hemoglobin production at high altitude. The version of EPAS1 found in Tibetans traces back to Denisovan origin. It's this Denisovan variant that lets Tibetans live and work at elevations above 4,000 meters without succumbing to the severe altitude sickness that would disable someone from the lowlands. The ancestors of today's Tibetans picked up this gene variant by interbreeding with Denisovans, who had lived on the Tibetan plateau long enough for that adaptation to develop in the first place. Without that Denisovan ancestry, Tibetans would not have been physically capable of settling one of the largest high-altitude regions on Earth. The Denisovans adapted to the Tibetan plateau, and in a real sense, their descendants are still living there today. In August of 2025, a new study confirmed that genes of Denisovan origin helped humans who crossed the Bering Strait on their way into the Americas. In particular, the gene called MUC19, tied to cold adaptation and immune function, appears to have given the first Americans an edge in surviving the harsh conditions of the crossing through Beringia. Denisovans helped populate the Americas. They did it through their DNA, 30,000 years after their own species had already died out. A high-quality genome from a Denisovan man who lived 200,000 years ago, released as a preprint in October of 2025, revealed fresh details about the biology of this ancient human. The population genetics of the Pleistocene human world turned out to be nothing like the neatly separated lineages early researchers imagined. Instead, it was a tangled web of repeated contact, interbreeding, and gene exchange across species lines, one we are only now starting to map with any real accuracy. We still don't know what a Denisovan actually looked like. What we have is a jaw fragment from the Shaher cave on the Tibetan plateau, where hominin traces were found at a record height of roughly 3,400 meters, along with a handful of teeth and bone fragments from the Denisova cave itself. The jaw is large, bigger than any modern human jaw, pointing to a powerfully built body. The teeth are enormous, larger than Neanderthal teeth and larger than most Homo sapiens teeth, and their shape suggests specialized dietary adaptations. Working from the genome, researchers managed to reconstruct some physical traits. Denisovans likely had dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes, much like Neanderthals. Their skulls may have been wide and low, but the face itself remains unknown. A species that left a genetic trace in hundreds of millions of living people is represented in the fossil record by a handful of bones and teeth that would fit in a jacket pocket. While the Denisovan face stays lost in a scattered fossil record, another human species was living in Africa. It was so strange, so anatomically contradictory, and so unexpected in its timing that announcing its fossils in 2015 forced a complete rethink of the human family tree. The announcement of the discovery of Homo naledi became one of the most dramatic events in paleoanthropology in decades. In 2013, cavers pointed a team of researchers led by Lee Berger from the University of the Witwatersrand toward a narrow chamber deep inside the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa. This is the same region known as the Cradle of Humankind, where more hominin remains have been found than almost anywhere else on Earth. The only way into the chamber was through a vertical shaft just 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point. Researchers of small build were specifically chosen for the excavation. They had to work lying down in spaces barely large enough to turn their heads. What they found stunned everyone. More than 1,500 fossils belonging to at least 15 hominins of different ages, from infants to elderly individuals, were scattered throughout the chamber. It is the largest collection of hominin remains ever found at a single African site. The anatomy of these remains looked like nothing described before. The brain of Homo naledi was about the size of an orange, somewhere between 400 and 600 cubic centimeters, roughly half the size of a modern human brain, and comparable to the brains of the earliest members of the genus Homo 2.5 million years ago. But its hands were almost identical to those of a modern human. The structure of the wrist, the proportions of the thumb, and the shape of the fingers pointed to a precise grip, the kind needed for handling tools and usually linked to strong cognitive skills. The feet were almost modern. The arch, the toe proportions, and the shape of the heel showed a walking style so close to ours that a Homo naledi footprint in the mud would be hard to tell apart from a modern human's. But the shoulders were angled forward the way an ape's are. The fingers stayed curved, a sign that a good part of life was spent climbing. And the face, with its small brain case and jutting features, looked ancient by any measure. The anatomy was a mosaic. Ancient and modern traits sat together in the same body in a way that couldn't be explained by the old idea of evolution as a straight line from primitive to advanced. Homo naledi wasn't some primitive ancestor on the way to becoming us. It was something else. A branch of the human family tree that went its own way. It held on to some old traits while independently picking up a few surprisingly human ones of its own. Then the dating results came in. Because of the small brain size, researchers first guessed that Homo naledi was very old, maybe 2 million years, maybe even older. But the dating showed that the remains from the Dinaledi chamber were between 235,000 and 335,000 years old. So Homo naledi, with its tiny brain and mixed anatomy, was walking through southern Africa at roughly the same time Homo sapiens first showed up. At that same point, big-brained Neanderthals were thriving in Europe, and Denisovans were spreading across Asia. The world back then wasn't heading toward one single human species. It was more like several experiments running side by side. Then the argument got sharper. In 2023, Lee Berger and his colleagues announced that in the nearby hill antechamber, they'd found signs of deliberate burial, bodies placed into graves. On the walls, there were marks that looked like intentional engravings. If that holds up, it means a species with less than half our brain size was engaging in symbolic behavior, giving meaning to death, and deliberately leaving marks on the world around it, which goes directly against the long-held belief that symbolic thinking needs a brain the size of a modern human's. The announcement stirred up debate right away. Other researchers looked at the evidence and said the case for burials and engravings wasn't solid enough. The position of the bodies could be explained by natural processes, and the marks on the walls could just be natural formations. The argument is still going. The evidence is still disputed, but the question it raises isn't easy to brush aside. If Homo naledi really did something like this, with a brain about the size of an orange, what does that say about the connection between brain size and cognitive ability? What does it say about the nature of intelligence itself? At the very least, it shows we've already been wrong about what certain species are capable of. And it shows the story of human thinking is a lot more complicated than the simple idea that a bigger brain means a smarter animal. The island branches of the human family tree probably give the most extreme and the most striking examples of what happens when human populations get cut off from the mainland evolutionary story and develop on their own. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, was discovered in 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores. The remains from Liang Bua Cave date to somewhere between about 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis was a tiny creature, standing about 1 meter tall, weighing somewhere between 25 and 30 kilograms, with a brain of roughly 400 cubic centimeters, even smaller than that of Homo naledi. And yet this species used stone tools, hunted the dwarf elephants that lived on Flores, and knew how to control fire. It likely lived on Flores for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing, and that disappearance probably wasn't a coincidence. It lined up with the arrival of Homo sapiens in island Southeast Asia. The small size of Homo floresiensis is explained by island dwarfism, a well-known evolutionary process in which large animals on isolated islands with limited resources shrink generation after generation, since smaller individuals need less food and reproduce more successfully when resources run short. The same process produced the dwarf elephants that Homo floresiensis hunted. The island became a kind of laboratory where, at least in terms of body size, evolution seemed to run in reverse. But cognitive ability apparently stayed high enough for making tools and hunting together. Then, in 2019, scientists announced the discovery of a second island dwarf human. Homo luzonensis, from the Philippine island of Luzon, is known from a handful of teeth and some foot and hand bones, found in Kalau Cave and dated to roughly 50 to 67,000 years ago. The structure of the foot bones in Homo luzonensis looks primitive, sharing features with Australopithecines, pre-human hominins from 3 million years back. Yet the teeth are smaller and evolutionarily more advanced. This species is another example of human traits developing independently on an isolated island, another branch of the genus Homo evolving in parallel. off to the side of the mainland story. Both island species disappeared. Within the accuracy limits of the dating methods available, both extinctions line up with the arrival of modern humans. Whether that arrival was the cause, through direct violence, competition for resources, or diseases the island populations had no immunity to, is unknown. The pattern is there, but how to read it remains debated. By 50,000 years ago, the number of surviving human species besides Homo sapiens was shrinking fast. On Java, the last populations of Homo erectus held on. Neanderthals in Europe had only a few thousand years left. Denisovans were fading out of the fossil and genetic record. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis had already vanished or were close to it. And Homo sapiens was everywhere, spreading across Europe, moving through Asia, reaching Australia, and later through Beringia, arriving in the Americas. And that leaves a question, maybe the most important one, and the most honest one in the whole study of human evolution. Why? Why us? Why did the rest go extinct? We have partial answers tied to climate, competition, and demographics. But why did we survive when they didn't? What did Homo sapiens have that Homo heidelbergensis lacked, with its comparable brain size, hunting skill, fire, and wooden spears? What did we have that Neanderthals lacked, with their empathy, their burials, and probably even bigger brains? What advantage was enough to make the last 40,000 years turn out the way they did? One species, one planet, no competition. The honest answer is that we don't know for sure, but the evidence points in several directions at once. First, the size of social networks. Везде, где мы находим следы самых первых групп Homo sapiens за пределами Африки, видно одно и то же. Эти люди поддерживали обменные сети огромного размаха, перемещая сырье, готовые изделия и, почти наверняка, разные сведения на расстояние в сотни, а порой и тысячи километров. Обсидиановое лезвие, обнаруженное на одной из стоянок в Кении, было принесено из источника, находившегося дальше, чем 300 километров от места находки. Морские ракушки, которые использовались как украшения, встречаются на стоянках вглубь материка, далеко от любого берега. Такой дальний обмен говорит о том, что существовали связи между группами, которые никогда не виделись лицом к лицу. А значит, работала целая система обязательств, репутации и доверия, выходившая далеко за пределы близкого родства и своей же локальной группы.
Благодаря такой расширенной сети сведений о ресурсах, угрозах, новых приемах и способах выживания могли быстро распространяться на огромных территориях. Второй момент — это символическое мышление, то есть умение создавать абстрактные знаки, работать с ними и передавать через них смысл другим. Именно с этим связана целая археологическая перемена, которую называют становлением поведенческой современности. Резкий рост числа личных украшений, использование красящих веществ, геометрических насечек и, в конце концов, изобразительного искусства у Homo sapiens появляется раньше, чем у любого другого вида, и достигает такого размаха и сложности, каких прежде не было. Ведутся споры, отражает ли это настоящую разницу в мышлении между нами и неандертальцами, или же дело просто в неполноте ископаемых находок. Но масштаб символического поведения у Homo sapiens действительно отличается по своей сути от всего, что удалось найти у наших вымерших родственников. Символическое мышление важно еще и тем, что позволяет хранить знания не только в отдельной голове, а вовне, в резьбе на кости, в наскальном рисунке, в общем предании и так превращать опыт в систему, которая накапливается из поколения в поколение, чего одна лишь память отдельного человека дать не может. Третий момент, и, пожалуй, самый неожиданный, это половые связи. Здесь огромную роль сыграло скрещивание между разными группами древних людей. У многих азиатских народов до сих пор сохранилась денисовская ДНК. А в геномах некоторых африканских народов заметны следы смешения с одной или несколькими пока неизвестными древними группами людей, призрачными линиями, которых до сих пор не нашли в ископаемых остатках. Мы не были войском завоевателей, которое стерло с лица земли все, что существовало до нас. Мы были очень общительным видом, склонным к многочисленным связям, и скрещивались с каждой близкой нам формой людей, которую встречали на своем пути, вбирая в свой генофонд их приспособления, иммунные гены, особенности организма, помогающие переносить холод и способность жить высоко в горах. Возможно, в этом и заключается самая глубокая ирония нашей эволюционной истории. Выжил не тот вид, у которого были лучшие собственные приспособления. Выжил тот, кто лучше всех умел перенимать чужие. Иммунная система современного человека частично неандертальская. Способность тибетцев жить высоко в горах – это наследие денисовцев.
А переход через Берингов пролив, благодаря которому люди заселили Америку, стал возможен во многом из-за денисовских генов, помогавших переносить холод. Мы вовсе не чистокровный продукт одной единственной эволюционной линии. Мы составное существо, мозаика из вкладов всех видов, которые мы когда-либо встречали и с которыми скрещивались. Проигравшие в этой гонке линии на самом деле продолжают жить внутри победителя и жили в нем всегда. Это понимание меняет что-то очень важное в том, как мы смотрим на самих себя. Представление о нашей исключительности, будто Homo sapiens, особый вид, принципиально не похожий на все, что было раньше, и неизбежный итог эволюции, как будто изначально нацеленный на наше появление, не подтверждается тем, что мы на самом деле находим. We see 9 species, each with remarkable abilities, each adapted to its own environment, each running its own experiment in what it means to be human. 8 of them came to an end. One survived, partly because of its own qualities, partly because of circumstance, and partly because of the genetic inheritance it picked up from the ones it replaced. Our monopoly on humanity has lasted 40,000 years. Next to Homo erectus, whose experiment ran for 2 million years, we've barely gotten started. Whether Homo sapiens turns out to be the longest-running experiment of the genus Homo or just the most recent one isn't a question we'll see answered in our lifetimes. But here's what we can say with confidence. The world that produced us wasn't a world with a single story. 9 stories were unfolding in it at the same time. 8 of them ended. But they didn't vanish without a trace. Their mark is still in our blood, in our immune systems, in our ability to breathe thin air at the roof of the world, in our ability to survive crossing a frozen land bridge onto an unpopulated continent. 8 species that never became us. They're still here. They're reading these words right now. They're watching this video. In the most literal biological sense, they became part of the species that survived. We aren't the last humans because we were the best. We're the last humans because we were the most human. Better than anyone at recognizing ourselves in others, at forming bonds with them, at taking what they had and making it our own. And if you sit with that fact long enough, something close to a debt starts to show through it. Let's go back to Homo heidelbergensis. This species deserves more than a single paragraph. It deserves the same close attention we give the Neanderthals, because in many ways it shaped history even more than the Neanderthals did, yet it's far less studied. 700,000 years ago is when Homo heidelbergensis clearly appears in the fossil record, though its roots reach further back into a hazy transitional period out of Homo erectus that paleoanthropologists have been arguing about for more than a century. 700,000 years ago, Europe was a cold, hostile, ecologically harsh place. The glacial cycles of the Pleistocene were intensifying. Warm interglacial periods kept giving way to ice ages when the ice sheets of northern Europe pushed south as far as what is now Germany and England. Average temperatures dropped by 8 to 12 degrees Celsius. The continent's megafauna, the woolly mammoth, the cave bear, the straight-tusked elephant, the giant deer with antlers spanning up to 3 meters, either retreated south or died out. Into this environment came Homo heidelbergensis. And it didn't just survive, it thrived. The site at Boxgrove in West Sussex, England, is one of the most important Homo heidelbergensis locations in Europe. It's around 500,000 years old, and it preserves an unusually detailed picture of how these people lived. At what was once the shore of a shallow coastal lagoon, the bones of horses, rhinoceroses, and large deer turn up in abundance. And these aren't the remains of animals that died natural deaths. These are bones butchered systematically and skillfully. The marks point to coordinated hunting by groups able to bring down prey many times the size of any single hunter. The stone tools found at Boxgrove rank among the finest hand axes ever discovered anywhere in the world. Symmetrical, carefully shaped, they were made through a series of controlled strikes that demanded both technical knowledge and fine motor skill. And among the animal remains at Boxgrove, there's a human shin bone, Homo heidelbergensis. Its surface bears cut marks. Someone had eaten this man. Whether it was another predator or members of his own kind, we don't know. The Schöningen spears were found back in the 1990s in a lignite mine in Lower Saxony, Germany. They might be the most astonishing artifacts left behind by any extinct human species.
8 spears, made from young spruce trunks, had lain for about 300,000 years in waterlogged sediment. Their length ranges from about 1.80 meters to 2.5 meters. These aren't just sharpened sticks. They're carefully crafted throwing weapons. The greatest diameter and the main mass sit roughly where you'd find them on a modern sport javelin, right where engineering calculations say the optimal center of mass for a thrown spear should be. These aren't jabbing sticks, and they weren't made only for close combat. They're throwing weapons, built for an accurate, powerful throw at a target from a distance. Their makers understood the physics of throwing, even if they couldn't put that understanding into words. Next to the spears lay the bones of more than 20 horses, showing clear signs of butchering. Homo heidelbergensis wasn't some random scavenger on the sidelines of the food chain. He was a top predator, deliberately hunting large game with purpose-built, long-range weapons, working together in coordinated groups in an Ice Age Europe, an environment that would have pushed any tropical primate to the limits of endurance. Homo heidelbergensis also built shelters. At the Terra Amata site in France, there's evidence of shelters built around 380,000 years ago, oval structures made of branches held down with stones, with hearths inside. This evidence is debated, as almost all data from such deep antiquity tends to be. Still, it's a good indication that Homo heidelbergensis didn't limit himself to natural caves, but actually built protected spaces himself, shaping the landscape rather than just living in it. So why did this species disappear? Research points to climate. In the late Middle Pleistocene, during the time Homo heidelbergensis existed, glacial cycles kept getting harsher. The
The species had formed under specific climate conditions and had its own climatic niche, a range of temperatures and environments in which it could survive and reproduce effectively. Statistical modeling of the link between Homo heidelbergensis sites and the climate at the time they were inhabited shows something striking. Right before the species vanishes from the fossil record, its climatic niche shrank sharply. The conditions it was adapted to became increasingly rare. The territory suitable for living kept shrinking.
And while the African branch of its lineage was turning into Homo sapiens, the heidelbergensis populations themselves, already under climate stress, found themselves competing both with their own descendant species and with the Neanderthals, another one of their descendant lines. They were being squeezed out from two sides at once by the very species they had given rise to. There's something almost like an ancient myth in this, a parent species devoured by its own children. Now let's talk about what happened when Homo sapiens first stepped out of Africa into a world already inhabited by other humans. Because the familiar story, anatomically modern humans appear, spread quickly, and push out archaic populations thanks to superior intelligence and technology, is almost certainly wrong in the details, and possibly wrong at its very foundation. The newest data suggests that Homo sapiens didn't leave Africa in a single migratory wave, but in several pulses spread out over maybe 100,000 years. The earliest confirmed stone tools made by Homo sapiens outside Africa turned up in Mislia Cave in Israel, dated to roughly 180,000 years ago. That means our species was already in the Levant almost 200,000 years back, long before the major wave out of Africa that eventually populated the rest of the planet. These early wanderers, though, left no real genetic mark on any population alive today. It looks like they either went extinct or got absorbed without leaving any visible trace. It was a false start, a group that made it beyond Africa's borders and then simply disappeared. The migration that actually spread across the world seems to have started around 70,000 years ago. It may have been sparked by some genetic or cultural shift within the African sapiens population, something that made sustained long-range movement possible. This is the wave we all descend from. Moving through the Middle East, Central Asia, Europe, Southeast Asia, and eventually reaching Australia, this wave ran into every other human species still around at the time. Each of these encounters unfolded in its own way. Genetics tells us that interbreeding happened in every single case, but the extent of it varied enormously. Neanderthals ended up contributing somewhere between 1% and 4% of the genome in people outside Africa today, and that contribution isn't spread evenly. It clusters in specific regions of the genome. That pattern suggests some Neanderthal genes turned out to be useful and were kept by natural selection, while others were probably weeded out, which explains why Neanderthal ancestry is thinner in the parts of the genome tied to male fertility and cognitive function. Denisovan ancestry runs higher in certain groups, reaching up to 5% among Papuans and lower elsewhere. And unidentified archaic African groups left their mark on the genomes of some populations south of the Sahara. In every one of these cases, the pattern looks less like random mixing and more like selective assimilation. Our ancestors picked up whatever was useful from the species they crossed paths with and let the rest fade into extinction. That's not really how we usually imagine one species replacing another. The familiar picture, competition, displacement, extinction, is accurate, but it's only part of the story. A substantial piece of it was something closer to genetic annexation. We didn't simply outcompete the other species, we folded parts of them into ourselves. Think about what that means for understanding how varied people are today.
Tibetans who live and work at 4,000 meters above sea level, with hemoglobin regulation that lets them function on oxygen levels that would knock out someone from the lowlands, carry a Denisovan gene variant. Shaping that variant may have taken the ancient Denisovans on the Tibetan plateau thousands of generations. Tibetans didn't evolve that trait on their own. They inherited it from a species that no longer exists through interbreeding that took place tens of thousands of years ago. In the most literal sense, they're living off the results of Denisovan evolution. The Denisovans worked out how to survive at high altitude. Tibetans inherited that solution. The same holds for immune gene variants passed down from Neanderthals, particularly variants of the HLA genes, which code for the proteins the immune system uses to recognize pathogens. These genes handed early Homo sapiens populations moving into Europe and Asia immune responses that Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years building up against local pathogens. Our ancestors arrived in Europe as immunological outsiders and ran straight into diseases they had never faced before. Neanderthal genes, picked up through interbreeding with the very population they were pushing toward extinction at the time, helped them survive those diseases.
There's a grim irony in that, one that's hard to miss. Neanderthals may have unwittingly contributed to their own disappearance by making the population that replaced them more resistant to the diseases found in the very environment the Neanderthals were being pushed out of. As for direct violence, whether Homo sapiens deliberately killed Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other species they encountered, the fossil record simply can't settle that question. We don't have a Neanderthal skeleton with a Homo sapiens spear point lodged in it, and there's no clear forensic proof of violence between these groups. But the absence of proof doesn't mean the thing itself never happened. Modern humans are the only species in the history of life on Earth known to have hunted other species deliberately into extinction. The clearest documented cases are the megafauna extinctions that followed Homo sapiens spreading into Australia, the Americas, and other regions. It would honestly be strange if a species capable of systematically wiping out mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and cave lions, couldn't apply that same kind of pressure on rival human species, sharing the same land and fighting for the same resources. Most likely, the replacement of archaic human species by Homo sapiens was a messy process, different from place to place, and it probably involved all of these mechanisms at once: interbreeding, competition, climate stress, direct clashes, and sheer demographic weight. The mix of these factors shifted depending on the region and the time period. There was no single event, no final battle, no exact moment when the last Neanderthal died and Homo sapiens declared victory. Instead, there was a long, grinding process of population decline that stretched across thousands of years and an entire continent. And in the end, only one species was left standing. So what strikes me most about all this? Speaking as the person behind this channel, someone who spent a lot of time thinking through these questions, I'll say it plainly. It's not triumph, it's loss. We're used to telling this as a success story. Homo sapiens wins, modern humans show up, and here we are. But stop and think about what was actually lost. Behind the Neanderthals stood 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the European environment. They knew which plants could heal and which were poisonous. They knew the migration routes of the animals they hunted. They knew where to find water and shelter, and where the rock outcrops with the best flint for tool-making could be found. Their bond with the landscape had built up over hundreds of generations, and it's honestly hard for us to even grasp how deep that connection ran.
All of that knowledge died along with them. We inherited their genes, but not their knowledge. The Denisovans spread across an enormous range, from Siberia all the way to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, and adapted to an incredible variety of environments. They worked out solutions to high altitude, tropical disease, and the specific ecological challenges of every place they settled. That took hundreds of thousands of years of slow, gradual buildup of both genetic and cultural knowledge. The genetic legacy they passed on to us is documented, but the cultural legacy, the knowledge, the techniques, the accumulated wisdom about how to live in those places can't be recovered. It's simply gone. Homo naledi, with its strange mix of primitive and modern anatomy and its possible burial practices, raises a question that genuinely unsettles me. What did it experience? Not in a sentimental way, and not to make it seem more human than it was, but as a real biological question. A species that may have marked the deaths of its own members and deliberately placed their bodies in specific spots is a species for which death held some kind of meaning. And meaning itself already belongs to the realm of consciousness. If Homo naledi felt about death even remotely the way we do, if it understood in some sense that its kin had been alive and then stopped being alive, and that this shift mattered, then the disappearance of Homo naledi meant the loss of a way of experiencing the world that was, in some sense, comparable to ours. Not identical, maybe not equal in complexity, but comparable in kind. That's not a comfortable thought, but it's an honest one. The last members of the human family outside our own species were likely the Denisovans, with isolated pockets possibly surviving in island Southeast Asia as recently as 15,000 years ago. By 30,000 years ago, across most of the world, Homo sapiens was the only human species left. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The world went from 9 experiments down to 1.
And that one surviving experiment, us, no longer had rivals, alternatives, or another version of humanity that could hold back our spread or offer a different path. For the last 40,000 years, we've been alone. As the evolutionary biologist Nick Longrich pointed out, from a historical standpoint, this is odd. Not so long ago, we weren't special. We were just one option among several. Now, only one option is left, and faint traces of all the others are written into our genomes. I think that matters, and it should reshape how we see ourselves, not as some inevitable outcome of evolution marching toward intelligence and the future, not as a superior species that beat out lesser competitors, but as the survivor of a historical process that could have turned out differently at many points along the way, if the climate had shifted a bit earlier or a bit later, if some Neanderthal population had developed a slightly stronger immune response, if Denisovan groups had stayed in closer contact with one another, making them less vulnerable to local die-offs, if 250,000 years ago, Homo naledi had faced a slightly different environment in southern Africa. At any of these turning points, things could have gone another way. Not necessarily, but they could have. 40,000 years of humans having the planet to themselves wasn't written into the laws of nature. It came out of a chain of events, many of them down to chance. And that very chain is what produced us. We, the last humans, hold an extraordinary position. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's something a little lonely about it. We evolved in a world of human diversity, a world where being Homo sapiens meant being just one kind of human among several, where the genus Homo existed at the same time as several different experiments in intelligence, culture, and adaptation. That world is gone. The world we live in now, one species, one lineage, a monopoly on being human, isn't the world we evolved in. It's what came after that older world ended. And still, the others haven't vanished entirely. They live on in the genes of every Tibetan who breathes thin mountain air without strain. They live on in the immune system of every European whose ancestors made it through the diseases of the Ice Ages. They're in the cold-adapted genes of the first Americans who crossed the Beringian land bridge and looked out at a continent waiting to be settled. 8 species that didn't make it into the present still left their mark on the one that did. We're not a blank page, we're a palimpsest, a manuscript written over again and again. Each new layer is incomplete. Each new layer still carries traces of what came before it. The Neanderthals wrote on us. The Denisovans wrote on us. Unknown archaic Africans wrote themselves into us. And somewhere in that layered text, buried in the multi-part history carried by every human genome on Earth, there's still a record of 8 species that came so close to being us. There's one detail about how the Neanderthals disappeared that most popular accounts leave out, and it noticeably shifts the emotional tone of the whole story. The Neanderthals didn't vanish all at once. They pulled back. When Homo sapiens began pushing into Europe from the east around 45,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations didn't simply collapse. Their range shrank instead. They withdrew from the eastern and central European lands they'd once held and gathered into western refuges on the Iberian Peninsula, along the Atlantic coast of France, in the caves and valleys of what's now northern Spain. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites are in southern Spain, at Gorham's Cave on the Rock of Gibraltar, dated to roughly 42,000 years ago. Gibraltar, the far southwestern tip of Europe, surrounded by water on 3 sides, where on a clear day you can see Africa across just 14 kilometers of strait, became the last stronghold of a species that had once spread from Portugal to the Ural Mountains, from the shores of the North Sea to the deserts of the Middle East. That's where they held on. Exactly how much longer after Gorham's Cave, we don't know. The dating methods we have carry an error margin of several thousand years either way. But the overall picture is clear. The population kept shrinking toward a geographic dead end, growing smaller and more fragmented, until the isolation became total. The Neanderthals didn't go out with a dramatic ending. They faded like a fire burning down to its last embers in a far corner of the continent, while a new fire was spreading across the rest of the world. This same geographic pattern, retreat into a refuge, a final concentration in marginal environments, and eventual disappearance, shows up again and again in other megafauna extinctions that followed the spread of Homo sapiens. On mainland Siberia, woolly mammoths disappeared around 10,000 years ago. A small population isolated on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean survived until about 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years longer than the mainland population. The same pattern of survival on islands and peninsulas keeps repeating. When a species disappears under the combined pressure of climate change and human presence, the last individuals end up in the most isolated and hard-to-reach places. Gibraltar was, in effect, the Neanderthals' own Wrangel Island. It's an uncomfortable comparison to make with mammoths, but a useful one. We don't usually describe the extinction of mammoths as a triumph. In recent decades, people tend to talk about it with a sense of regret, recognizing that the mammoth's disappearance left the ecosystem it lived in poorer, that the Pleistocene world was richer for having them in it, and that losing them was a real loss. We're starting to use that same kind of language for other megafauna extinctions that followed human expansion. But applying it to the Neanderthals still isn't common. Maybe because admitting the loss of another human species feels more personal than admitting the loss of a large trunked animal.
But the logic is the same. The world was richer when Neanderthals were part of it. Their disappearance was a loss. And we were one of the mechanisms behind that disappearance. Now let's turn briefly to the timeline of the Denisovans. Genetics lets us reconstruct a history of striking geographic reach. The oldest Denisovan we have direct evidence for is a man about 200,000 years old from Denisova Cave, whose genome came out as a preprint in October 2025. This person, who lived in the Altai Mountains 200,000 years ago, already carried Neanderthal DNA. That tells us Denisovans and Neanderthals had been interbreeding long enough for that contact to leave a clear mark on his genome. Denisovans and Neanderthals weren't strangers to each other. In a real sense, they were neighbors, sharing vast stretches of Asia, sometimes crossing paths at the edges of their territories, and occasionally leaving behind children together. Back in 2018, a bone fragment from Denisova Cave turned out to belong to the very first generation of offspring from a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. The researchers who studied her genome nicknamed her Denny.
At the time of her death, she was at least 13 years old. She was a girl, and her DNA was exactly half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. She wasn't a fluke or a one-off accident. The very fact that she existed, that a Neanderthal and a Denisovan met near or inside Denisova Cave and produced a child capable of surviving into early adolescence, shows that the genetic distance between the two groups hadn't yet made their offspring infertile or unable to survive. Biologically, they were still close enough that their children could live, and if the children lived, some of them could go on to reproduce themselves. So gene exchange between Denisovans and Neanderthals was real, and it happened more than once. The jawbone from Xiahe, found in the karst cave of Baixia and dated to at least 160,000 years old, shows that Denisovans were living at extreme altitude long before any other known human species reached that area. 160,000 years ago is an extraordinarily early time for humans to be present above 3,000 meters. At that height, low oxygen, brutal cold, and scarce food would create enormous challenges for any population without special physiological adjustments. The fact that Tibetans inherited the EPAS1 gene variant, tuned for high-altitude living, precisely from Denisovans, tells us the Denisovans at Xiahe weren't just passing through. They lived at that elevation long enough for natural selection to shape their high-altitude physiology to a remarkable degree. They solved the problem of living on the roof of the world so well that their solution still works inside the bodies of Tibetans today, tens of thousands of years after the Denisovans themselves disappeared. The southernmost trace of Denisovans, which genetics finds in Papuans, Australian Aboriginal people, and Filipino Negrito groups, requires that Denisovans were present in Southeast Asia around the time Homo sapiens began moving through that region, roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago. So it turns out Denisovans were living at the same time in the Altai Mountains at high latitudes, on the Tibetan Plateau at extreme elevation, and in the tropics of Southeast Asia at low latitudes. That's a geographic and ecological range comparable to Homo erectus, and even greater than the Neanderthals. Denisovans weren't a geographically limited population. They were a widely spread species that successfully settled into radically different environments, and in each one they began adapting in their own particular way. We're only just starting to document the genetic legacy of those adaptations in the populations that replaced them. The disappearance of the Denisovans is even less understood than the disappearance of the Neanderthals. We don't have a clear end date for when they vanished. What we have is simply the absence of clearly Denisovan DNA after a certain point in the genetic record,
paired with a fossil record that stays quiet apart from a handful of specimens. By 15,000 years ago, they were already gone. It's likely that most Denisovans had vanished by around 40,000 years ago. Anything more precise than that is still beyond the reach of current methods. But even with how little we actually know about the Denisovans, they left behind a mark on the modern human genome that's completely out of proportion to that knowledge. For a species represented by a few teeth, a jaw fragment, and a small handful of bone pieces from a single cave, their genetic footprint on living humanity is extraordinary. Their high-altitude adaptation genes are carried today by millions of Tibetans. Their immune-related genes may be present in populations across Asia. Their cold adaptation genes crossed the Bering Strait and made their way into the Americas. A being we can't picture, can't fully reconstruct, and can't attach to any known face. A being we know mainly as a string of nucleotide bases pulled out of an ancient bone, and yet that being shaped the biological makeup of hundreds of millions of people alive today. This might be the biggest lesson ancient genomics has to offer. Extinction isn't as final as it looks. A species can disappear from the fossil record, stop existing as a breeding population, leave no descendants in the usual sense, and still survive inside the genome of the species that replaced it. It can go on shaping the biology of living people 10,000 generations later, still handing down solutions to problems that would have been much harder to solve without that inherited genetic material. The Denisovans died out. And yet, in a very real biological sense, the Denisovans are still here. That's a genuine paradox, and it's one of the strangest truths the genomic revolution has uncovered in paleoanthropology.
Before wrapping up, I want to circle back to Homo naledi, because in my view, this is the species that raises the toughest questions of all. And those questions deserve to be stated plainly, without softening them. The debate over whether Homo naledi buried its dead and made engravings hasn't been settled. The researchers who put forward these claims are serious scientists with direct access to the original material. The researchers who challenge those conclusions are equally serious, and their methodological objections carry just as much weight. The evidence will keep being evaluated, and the question might eventually get resolved, or it might stay contested forever, the way plenty of paleoanthropology questions do. But here's what isn't in dispute. Homo naledi lived in southern Africa between roughly 235,000 and 335,000 years ago. Its brain was about a third the size of a modern human brain, and it existed in an environment where early Homo sapiens were already present. These two species lived at the same time. They occupied the same geographic region. Whether they ever crossed paths, and if so, what those encounters looked like, is unknown. It's also unknown whether Homo sapiens had a hand in the disappearance of Homo naledi. All we know is that Homo naledi disappeared and we survived, and the gap between those two facts is short enough that a possible connection can't be ruled out. Maybe we encountered Homo naledi. Maybe we were the last thing it ever encountered. We simply don't know. The 9 species of the genus Homo together represent roughly 2.5 million years of evolutionary experimentation within a single genus. They show the full range of what it means to be human, from the earliest members of the lineage, small-brained and small-bodied, to the large-brained, culturally complex species at the far end of it. They inhabited every major environment on Earth, from the tropics to the subarctic. They made tools, kept fire going, built shelters, cared for the injured, buried their dead, and at least in some cases, made art. Each of them was a full answer to one question. How does a highly social primate survive in a world full of predators, rivals,
and a climate you can't predict. 8 of those answers disappeared. 1 stayed. And the one that stayed still carries pieces of the ones that didn't, in its genome, in its immune system, in the way its body adjusts to altitude and cold. So next time you're way up in the mountains breathing just fine, next time your immune system fights off some germ that could have killed your ancestors before they ever picked up Neanderthal immune genes, next time you stop to wonder what it really means to be human, remember this: you're not the final word on that question. You're the latest draft of an answer that 8 other species spent 2.5 million years writing and rewriting, never making it to this last version. They were almost us. And in the one sense that matters most, they still are. What we've always felt in this was that they were chapters,